Hi, everyone. William Solomon here, founder and CEO of the ACMA, the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs. Welcome to our special live series today, which is on drug launch, horror stories, upskilling in medical affairs, and more. Pleasure to be here. So, over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about drug launches, and unfortunately, some drug launches that had a debacle and why they had a debacle. And then we're going to talk a little bit about medical affairs and upskilling. And so, a lot of studies have been done by many of the major consulting firms in the life sciences industry space that have shown that about a third of drug launches fail. A third of drug launches fail. And so it's definitely an important topic, especially for those that are working with companies and getting ready for a launch. What can you do better? What can you do differently, especially when you're within medical affairs or as an MSL? Just to remind you before we start about a little about the ACMA. The ACMA works with pharmaceutical companies to offer standardized accredited certification for medical affairs and MSL professionals. And also we offer training, credentialing, and certification for field reimbursement managers. And we also offer digital technology solutions. So reach out to us if you have any questions regarding that. So if you look at the last 15 years, about half of the drug launches in the industry have underperformed based on analyst sales estimates. This is by more than 20%. In fact, only one-fifth of new meds reach a sales target of 1 billion in the US, and more than half fail to even hit 250 million. Okay. And so when we think about drug launches and we think about what's necessary really to be successful, there are several key factors that are involved, right? Several key factors that are involved and things that, again, are important to think about when you're working in the industry. So what are some of these factors that are necessary for a successful drug launch? One of the most important ones is timing to market. Timing to the market. When you think about you're getting ready to launch a product, what's going on in the market? What are the dynamics? And that's really important. Number two, who do you have to sell to? Are you going to be marketing this product to general practitioners, internists, FPs, etc., and specialists? If you are, then that's going to require quite a bit of marketing investment and a relatively large sales force and field medical team to be able to get that word out and provide the right education and selling messages. Now, as an example, if we take, for instance, PCSK9 inhibitors like Repatha and Praluent, for example, these are cholesterol-lowering drugs from Amgen, and Sanofi Regeneron. They were pegged really as all but certain blockbusters when they hit the market in 2015. But unfortunately, neither of them really came close to initial analyst predictions. Instead, they were hampered by many factors. And some of these included massive price cutting. And the other problem that they faced, which a lot of drugs face when they're launching in the cardiovascular and infectious disease space, is that the companies underestimated the barrier that they were going to face when they were planning on how to properly educate healthcare providers on why their product can help fill an important gap. And a lot of companies do this, especially in these large chronic disease state areas where you're trying to educate physicians on why this particular mechanism of action is important, and how it's going to kind of fill the current treatment armamentarium that you have. And that's a tall task. And oftentimes what we find is that larger companies, pharmaceutical companies with already established commercial teams, do a typically much better job, which is why you see a lot of smaller biotechs partnering with larger companies that have experience in sales. And that's, I would say the third point is, do you have a properly trained team? Is the team properly trained to be able to go out and actually effectively launch a product, both internally, but also externally within the field? And that's key. That's key. The fourth thing I would say is the product meeting a true need. Is it meeting a true need for healthcare providers? And a good example of this is Johnson and Johnson, who had its prostate cancer Zytiga, and I think it exemplifies maybe one of the best kinds of drug launches, really in recent history. It was a new drug for a relatively pressing health problem for patients within the urology space, and it was very different from its competitors. So it distinguished itself from its competitors. And so being successful with a drug launch also means anticipating potential obstacles. One of the biggest obstacles today that companies face is reimbursement. Reimbursement. And so, for example, when you think about spotlighting, in this case, Zytiga with doctors and patients early and often, which is usually a functional role of the MSL and medical affairs teams, that's critical. And so J&J did a very, very good job of that. Of course, J&J has been around for a long time, and so they have that experience in being able to launch. In this case, again, unlike cardiovascular infectious diseases, they're launching specifically really to a specialist, market in terms of the urology market. We also know that, and we also seen some other examples, and know that being able to establish the need for a product is also important. So about 15% of all new drugs, 15% of all new drugs amount to relatively well differentiated treatments. And a good example of this is Merck's Gardasil. So if you remember back several years ago, Merck was launching Gardasil, which was a vaccine treatment for HPV. Company had a lot of data showing that the drug was very effective, the vaccine was effective, but unfortunately, being able to persuade doctors, and in this case, because it was going to younger patients in the pediatric population, parents, was also necessary, right? And I'm sure you remember seeing those television commercials on TV about Gardasil and about HPV and the importance of treating HPV. Again, here the role of the MSL and medical affairs professionals is very, very important. And that's key. The other thing that I would say is been a major stumbling block often for pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, is launching a product that has a poor clinical profile. If a product has a relatively weak clinical profile, weak efficacy, it's going to be difficult from a reimbursement standpoint, but also it's going to be difficult for your team to go out and actually properly educate and sell on the product. And so poor clinical profile definitely makes a difference, not just in terms of efficacy, but also in terms of the side effect profile. What does that side effect profile look like? We know many physicians oftentimes will wait before they adopt a new product, kind of wait until it's been out in the market and tried for a period of time before they take that chance with their patients. And certainly, having a strong clinical profile is important. Another major obstacle or blunder oftentimes is not properly calculating the budget you would need to really invest properly when it comes to marketing. Really invest properly in marketing. And this is one of the major reasons for drug failures, is that companies underestimate the investment that is required to really effectively market the product. Remember, when it comes to marketing the product, we're talking both about promotional and non-promotional avenues through the marketing team. And so, really needing to think carefully about what activities, what things you would actually have to do to really get the word out. But what does it take to really ensure that your team is properly trained? As I mentioned, our focus here at the ACMA in particular is on medical affairs and medical science liaison teams and getting them ready for drug launch. And why are there so many blunders? I think one of the biggest reasons that we find is that you have to remember the medical affairs MSL space is a very heterogeneous space. And so people coming from very different backgrounds from an educational standpoint, a lot of different types of training. And unfortunately, oftentimes what you find is there's not always consistency in terms of competencies and skills. And so what we found is that leaders oftentimes might overestimate the skills that are necessary for people being able to properly launch a product. And that's very, very important, right? This idea of consistency in skills and competencies and training that the team members have. And this is why, I'm personally a big advocate of working all the time on a continuous basis of upskilling your team. And the other area that I think is important is underestimating reimbursement and not factoring in the obstacles related to pricing. A good example of this was several years ago, back I think in 2012, Sanofi had a product for colorectal cancer, which was Zaltrap. I believe it had been marketed in the EU, and it was fairly expensive, about 10,000 a month. And as you can imagine, not surprisingly, providers didn't like that. There were less expensive alternatives that were just as good, and so that created, kind of the situation where they have the product, and the product really wasn't very well differentiated from their competition. And that created a situation where it made it very difficult to effectively launch the product. And so, that ability to really effectively go out and educate physicians, educate the other ancillary healthcare providers, also requires us within medical affairs to really understand what are our stakeholders looking for, right? What are they looking for? One of the things that often companies forget is that your physician isn't your only stakeholder, right? You have other ancillary healthcare providers, pharmacists, nurses, PAs that play an important role as well in being able to get traction for your product. Additionally, thinking about the research community and thinking about patients. Today more than ever, patients play a vital role in being able to get a product to gain traction in the market. And I would even argue oftentimes they play a very important role in helping to get that product approved from a regulatory standpoint. I myself have been to many meetings with the FDA when I was working in the pharmaceutical industry, and we would bring with us patient advocates, actual patients, and they would talk about the burden of the disease in their own lives. And I could tell you that it makes such a big difference when you get to hear from a patient and you get to hear their day in, day out struggles, and what they deal with and why this product potentially was able to help. That resonates quite a bit with the regulators. I've seen that in the US, I've seen that abroad as well with regulators. So I think we underestimate sometimes the role that patient and patient advocacy organizations play. So I think that's another big area, is really thinking about all of your stakeholder groups and thinking really carefully about how you can engage them properly. One of the other things too that I've seen is not coming out early enough and educating on the disease state. So I gave some examples here today with some particular products, but being able to really educate early on when it comes to the disease, being able to get out there to physicians even before the product is approved. Of course, we can't talk about the product itself or any potential indications that aren't approved, but we can certainly talk about the disease state itself and talk about how there are new mechanisms that are being looked at to address a particular burden of illness. And that I think is important to do. Typically what I see is companies are doing this late phase 2, early phase 3, depending on the situation, the particulars of the situation. But it's also something that really is critical for companies to invest in, is being able to get out early with your medical affairs and MSL team. And I think most of us would agree now more than ever, the medical affairs function is playing a highly strategic role in the industry versus what it was years ago. Matter of fact, a recent study showed that many of the future CEOs of pharmaceutical companies will come from medical affairs, and I think that's fantastic. There's a shifting tide. If you look historically, many of the leaders within the pharmaceutical industry came out of the sales and marketing divisions, and now the prediction is by 2025 you're going to see more and more people coming from within medical affairs, and I think that's fantastic. I think it also is a recognition of the important role that medical affairs plays, kind of at that interface between commercial and R&D, and also obviously being customer facing. So that's my take on drug launches and upskilling within medical affairs. I'm going to take a minute here to pause and see what questions we've gotten here. Let's take a look. Okay, so I got a question here about the role of board certification in medical affairs and how that might help contribute. I think that's a great question. Um, one of the things I think that's really important to understand is that, in the last several years, there's been a really significant shift in the industry towards more certification and credentialing for medical affairs and MSL professionals. And I think, part of that is, as everyone knows, the pharma industry is a heavily regulated industry, and being able to implement something like BCMAS, for example, really it gives a layer of additional credibility to an organization, right? By not just upskilling your team, but also it actually minimizes risk and maximizes compliance. Matter of fact, we have data to show that 70% of compliance officers within pharmaceutical companies agree. They agree 70% that having board certification in medical affairs can help to minimize risk and liability for a company. If, God forbid, that company is ever audited or anything that happens, that might be considered to be nefarious, it's always a good thing to be able to turn around and say, look, we've actually really upskilled our MSL medical affairs team. We've certified them through an outside independent accrediting body, and that really distinguishes them from sales. Because you have to remember, from an outside perspective, there really isn't a distinction, right, externally when it comes to medical affairs versus sales. There's not really that differentiation. And so being able to have some type of credential or certification that distinguishes medical from sales, I think plays a very, very important role. And we know this because a recent study that was done, that was published, that looked at what are the most important characteristics for key opinion leaders when they're looking at MSLs. One of the top things they look for, one of the top things was credibility. Credibility. So having that additional layer of credentialing, having a board certification that says to the community, to the world, that you meet a certain minimum standard of competency, I think is really important. And I would say this is worldwide, not just in the US. Matter of fact, this is one of the reasons why our program has within it a geo redirect technology platform, which basically enables an organization to train a global medical affairs MSL team at the snap of your fingers. Because what we do is we tailor the content to every region of the world when it comes to the regulatory and compliance rules and regulations. So, for example, if you are in Atlanta, you would take a BCMAS US version. But if you were in Berlin, you would take a European version. If you were in Brazil, there's actually a Brazilian version. And so the content, the integrity of the content is the same, but we adjust and tailor the content when it comes to the regulatory compliance rules and regulations. All right, so I have about a minute left. I want to thank everyone for their time, and I want to urge you to reach out to me with any questions that you might have. You can always reach out to us at the ACMA by emailing us at info@acmainfo.org. Thank you, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.